Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining this great event where we'll be discussing Africa's leadership in climate overshot response. And at a point within the session, we're going to have a great exchange with you all in the Q&A session. Um, just to give you a background, as you may be aware, the global community reached a consensus through the 2015 Paris Agreement on a comprehensive long-term objective to restrain the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and make efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Despite ample evidence from scientists since the Paris Agreement indicating profound risk associated with a 2 degree Celsius warning. The primary focus should be on preventing the breach of the 1.5 degree threshold. However, data from the World Met Organization reveals that the annual average global temperature in 2023 was 1.45 plus or minus 0.12 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is roughly between 1850 to 1900, with each month from June to December setting new records. July and August in particular marked the hottest month ever recorded. As the planet warms further, this risk, especially in Africa, will escalate, potentially causing irreversible harm to ecosystems, health, conflict, human mobility, migration, food security, water availability, and social stability. The impact on our environment, which is responsible, the impact on our continent, which is responsible for 4 degrees of global emission, and in which countries such as Kenya, global leaders in transition, pays the highest price. But what solutions are there when emission reductions are not advancing at the required pace? How to enhance the pace of GHG emission reductions? How to remove the large-scale stocks of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, how to push for more adaptation measures on the ground with better financing and support, and what to do, as Africans to frame and control the discussions on the financing and support part, and sorry, what to do as Africans to frame and control the discussion on the controversial technologies aimed at cooling the planet. To the CARE agenda of the Climate Overshoot Commission, which is an acronym for cut emissions, adapt, remove carbon dioxide, explore solar radiation modification. The members of the Climate Overshoot Commission have built a strategy to reduce the risk related to climate overshoot. We thrilled to engage into this discussion with a panel of experts who bring profound knowledge on our topic. Please allow me to introduce Dr. Agnes Kalibata, a distinguished leader in agricultural transformation in Africa. As the president of the Alliance for Green Revolution, she has spearheaded efforts to achieve food security and improve the livelihood of millions of smallholder farmers across the continent. Dr. Kalibata's impactful work includes serving as Rwanda's Minister of Agriculture and Animal Resources, where her initiatives significantly reduce poverty and achieve food security. Her global influence was further recognized when she served as the special envoy for the 2021 Food System Summit by the UN Secretary General, among her accolades are the prestigious African Food Prize and the National Academy of Sciences Public Welfare Medal. Dr. Kalibata's dedication to agricultural advancement is underpinned by her doctoral degree in entomology from UMA. Please welcome Yero Sarr, a dynamic Senegalese environmental activist recognized on Forbes 30 on the 30 list of most influential young Africans in 2022. Inspired by the global movement for climate action, Yero launched the Senegalese brand of the Fridays of the Future movement during his university studies in 2018, drawing attention to the pressing effects of global warming in Africa. His activism marked a significant contribution to raising awareness and driving change in environmental policies. Let's warmly welcome Dr. Chris Lennard, a leading climate scientist, at the Climate System Analysis Group. Dr. Lennard works span various interests from regional climate modeling and renewable energy to understanding extreme climate events and capacitating African climate scientists. He plays a pivotal role in several groundbreaking projects, including the Wind Atlas for South Africa and the Health Radar Project for disease modeling related to climate. An author of over 60 academic publications and contributor to the IPCC reports, his expertise is shaping our understanding of climate impact on Africa and beyond. As co-chair of the WCRP Academy and facilitator of Codex Africa, he is at the forefront of empowering climate research in developing countries. Beyond his professional achievements, Chris is motivated by his personal mission as a father of 2 boys, ensuring his work contributes to a safer climate future for the next generation. Welcome you all to this great panel. I'm going to start with Dr. Kalibata. Dr. Kalibata, I have 2 questions for you. Basically, the question will the deepest climate overshoot consequence all over Africa be represented by the threat on the agricultural sector and food security? And also, the Climate Overshoot Commission had 2 African members, yourself and Mr. Yusuf, former president of Niger. How were the Africans' concerns included in the making of the CARE agenda and in the deliberations of the Commission?
Thank you. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks and for the introduction. I'm glad to be here with you all, and thank you for accepting to be part of this conversation, which is based on the work of the Overshoot Commission. Now, to zoom in into the question that you're asking, the first question, which is about the impact of climate change and whether this would largely be on agriculture and food systems and food security. I mean, food systems and food security are going to suffer immensely, but it's not the only problem that is at hand or the biggest problem that is at hand. I think for Africa, the biggest shocks, and again, this is not to underrate the impact on livelihoods, but the biggest shock is going to be economic, because climate change impacts different spheres of the economy, impacts infrastructure in ways that makes it very difficult for countries to come up quickly and be able to adapt. It impacts individuals and communities and livelihoods at that level of infrastructure as well, which displaces livelihoods and makes it very difficult for communities to manage. So it does impact food and food security. And incidentally, food production systems are part of what is contributing to climate change. So it's almost a paradox. But really, it's going to be much more far-reaching than food and food systems. And I think the biggest impact is on livelihoods and life itself. We've seen people lose life, whether it is what happened in Libya sometime last year, or the types of floods. The level of flooding in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa has increased by 6 to 12 times this in the recent years as a result of climate change. So those are types of things that happen that completely disrupt life as we know it and livelihoods and take life. And that's going to be huge. So it goes beyond the impact on agriculture and food systems. Now, on the second question you asked, which is the role of the Commission and how the Commission engaged on African issues. The Commission was extremely concerned about in case we overshoot. And I guess the Commission, it's not for the Commission members and myself, it is no longer about in case. We've seen we actually have been able to overshoot 1.5 degrees. In November last year, we spent 10 days above 1.5 degrees, which is something, I mean, yeah, exactly, which is something that we thought we wouldn't do. And I'm sure people are beginning to become very concerned about that. But let me tell you how that portrays in real life. Now, in the midst of a rainy season here in Africa, in Southern Africa, countries like Zambia have had to declare a state of emergency because for 28 days, their temperatures increased and the amount of heat in that period of time was such that all the crops that were in the field were scorched. So they lost 70% of the crop. And that's in the midst of a season, just a heat wave that comes from nowhere, something they have never experienced before, that comes from nowhere and is going to be a leading cause of drought, is going to be a leading cause of food insecurity in a country that is not largely, but actually food secure. Zambia is known to be a food secure country. So just think about the impact of that on the wider economy and how it impacts the whole country. So the question is no longer about whether we overshoot. We are actually in the process of overshooting. Nairobi experienced, for 3 days, experienced temperatures in the beginning of this year that have never been experienced before. Again, the impact is on the economy, is on people, and is going to be on food security. The Overshoot Commission focused on how this impacts adaptation and adaptive capacity on the African continent, and how adaptation should focus on and prioritize countries in Africa and other places in the world where adaptation capacity is extremely low and weak, because those are the countries that are going to suffer the most. But also the Commission looked at different forms of climate financing and how climate financing today speaks to the needs of these countries that are struggling. So I really think, in a nutshell, besides building the awareness and helping build a certain level of consciousness and certain level of knowledge in the system, the putting at the center of the Commission's work the need for increased adaptation financing, but also overall rethinking climate financing so that African countries that are weakest and struggling with one challenge after another can be able to cope, was really the biggest benefit of the Commission for the African continent. And these things add up, these conversations add up, and these conversations influence how governments and leaders respond to some of the challenges that we live through.
Thank you so much for that in-depth analysis of how the Commission kind of incorporate concerns from Africa in the care agenda, and as well as how the threat of overshoot is already manifesting itself across the region. Dr. Lennard, you have a large experience in terms of impact of global warming, and more especially on our continent. Could you briefly tell us the main negative consequences of warming and of overshoot of the Paris Agreement objectives on different parts of Africa? What should we brace ourselves for?
Yes, let me not answer that final statement yet. Yeah, so I was one of the lead authors on the most recent IPCC Working Group 2 chapter, the Africa chapter. It's chapter 9, if you want to have a look at the executive summary. So what I'm going to take you through is really parts of the executive summary. I've just extracted some of the things from what we wrote in the chapter. First, about what the climate might be doing, and then what those impacts may be. So yeah, I think I'll be about 10 minutes. I hope that's fine. So our big summary statement in our chapter is basically that as we get warmer, as we get hotter, the African continent has contributed least to the emissions, to greenhouse gas emissions in the globe, but we are probably the most affected continent by climate change because we have the most vulnerable populations. within the continent. So we are suffering because of somebody else's activities. And that manifests really as we go forward in time, as the globe gets hotter and hotter, in 5 main ways, I suppose. The first is food production, which Dr. Kalibata alluded to, in that in most places of Africa, we see decreased food production. So that's crop growth. And then related to that, we see reduced economic growth. We see increased inequality and poverty compared with the global north. Increased human morbidity and human mortality. So that's more folk being ill and dying because of various climate change related issues. And then a big thing for me I come out of conservation biology is biodiversity loss and ecosystems degradation. And I'll go through those just now. And again, the reason for these impacts is that our populations within Africa are extremely vulnerable to small changes in climate. So even if there was climate change, with natural climate variability, we still had thousands of people dying because of drought, because of flooding. So we're incredibly vulnerable to small climate hazards or small changes in climate. So let me start with, or let me move on now to the observed and projected changes in climate. So temperature and rainfall is what I'll focus on. And the first is over the last 30, 40 years, we have seen increase in average temperatures and in the extremes of temperature. So more heat waves, more very hot days, more continuous hot days. And these all, we've observed them. We know that they're happening. We've also seen a similar thing in the oceans. So an increase in the number of marine heat waves and also the length of a marine heat wave. And marine heat waves are important because of fisheries. If the water gets too hot, the little algae can't live, the fish can't eat them, so the fish stocks drop for marine heat waves. And this is becoming, in the literature at least, more and more observed and more important for us to understand. So if that's what we've seen, where are we going to? And this is fairly unanimous in most of the projections. So the first is, as we go towards 2040, 2050, 2070, increase in the number of droughts in Southern Africa, West Africa, and North Africa. So this is agricultural and meteorological droughts. An increase in the intensity of extreme rainfall is noted in most places. If you're in East Africa, go and see the glaciers now, because projected by 2030, Mount Kenya will lose its glaciers, and then by 2040, Kilimanjaro will have lost its glaciers. And that has impacts on tourism again. Also, coming back to water heat, there's very strong consensus amongst the climate models of increases in marine and freshwater heat waves. So again, this impacts fisheries and communities that rely on fisheries. It's really important for them. And also the last thing I'll mention is that most places across Africa are projected to experience unprecedented temperatures in the next 40 odd years. So temperatures that we have never seen, never experienced before. And I think Dr. Kalibata also alluded to this in Nairobi. It's these really, really hot days, but then also the number of hot days in a row that doesn't let your body cool down. So kind of like heat waves. And these, we project that there will be more of these unprecedented temperature events. So what then do we think the impacts of these are? And I'll just go through a few themes that we looked at in our chapter. And I'll start with agriculture, because Africa is very agriculture centric and very interested in it. And we have seen already since 1961 a reduced crop yield. If you just take an African picture, there's going to be regional specificity here, but I'm looking at the entire continent. And a reduced crop yield and production to the extent that since 1961, there's been a decrease of 34% in yield as we've gone through since 1961. And then if we move forward in time, so what do we project? Again, similar decreases in production, largely because of a shortening of the growing season. In many places that shortens, and it means you don't get as much produce out as you could have. And also because of increased water stress, many places are projected to get drier, and that has consequence for drought. But then also we see projections in many places of extreme rainfall, and often extreme rainfall is actually more important or more detrimental to production, to agricultural production, than drought. You can have one flood at the wrong time and it'll wipe out everything. So that is important. At 2 degrees Celsius, so if we blast through in the early 2030s, we go through 1.5 degrees. If we hit 2 degrees in the 2050s odd, and as Jeremiah said, in 2050, my children will be 45 years old and 47 years old. So this is in their lifetime. There'll be a 20 to 40 degree decrease in yield in maize purely because of temperature. So these are the projections coming through, so impacts. And similar impacts on livestock. Again, animals need to cool down. If animals can't cool down, they're going to become ill and they won't produce as much. And similarly for freshwater fisheries, if the inland lakes get warmer, that's going to impact fisheries in a very detrimental way. So that's food systems and agriculture. What about biodiversity? So with every half a degree of change, of increase in global temperature, 30% of our species lose range where they can actually live in, or they lose 30% of their population. So biodiversity loss is really a big thing for us to consider when we're looking at the impacts of climate change. And at 2 degrees, the sudden loss of biodiversity in different places becomes a risk that is spread across the continent. So the climate refugee, the places where species are safe, seem to disappear when you have these big sun events. So you can imagine if you have a heat wave that lasts 2 weeks, it's going to really hurt a number of species. Then human health. We've already seen extreme temperature exposure. Extreme temperatures have increased, and we've seen mortality increase because of that, especially amongst women and amongst people who work outside, and that's the majority of the African workforce is outside. And the projections for that just make that worse. So yeah, we also see that in terms of that, as things get warmer, infectious diseases, so malaria and various others, can expand their range, and that becomes the vectors as well as the pathogens can now be in places where they never were. There's no immunity, so those populations suffer from that. And with extreme flooding, we also project an increase in diarrheal disease. I can't say that word. But folk become sick because of flooding, because they drink water that's infected. And they become ill. The last one, let me mention cities, because cities, we actually write in our chapter, right? Cities become hotspots of risk in climate change, because climate change amplifies pre-existing stresses that cities already experience. And then, it just becomes worse and worse. And those things are like stresses like poverty, like informality, the stressed food system, transport systems. Climate change amplifies all of these things. So if you live in a city now, which most people do, then what you're experiencing now becomes worse. The other thing about cities is that there's a projection that there will be mass urbanization. So many people will migrate into cities. So there'll be more and more people, more informality, more stress to deal with. And then that exacerbates the problem. As things get hotter, then within a city, you get urban heat islands that cause, again, mortality and morbidity amongst the human and animal population. If you have extreme rainfall, because informality rules, there's the water can't go anywhere. So it's when it floods badly, and then it pools, and then the mosquitoes can come and disease can spread. And then the last thing I'll say is about coastal cities. So again, with a lot of urbanization to coastal cities and the added stress of sea level rise and storm surge, that means coastal cities are really vulnerable to flooding events in particular. So let me stop there, and I'll take questions when it's question time. Thanks very much, Jeremiah.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that in-depth explanation of what we're currently experiencing and what we should brace ourselves for. Now, Mr. Sarr, Chris has said a lot of, things that we're currently battling with and things that we should experience. You are one of the young people that have brought forward, our worries as young people. on the political inaction to address climate change and to reduce emissions. What are your views and those of members of our generation on what needs to be done by African leaders, and how can we develop and make emerging economies understand and act on the impact of their emissions?
Thank you a lot, Jeremiah. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be part of this high level to talk about climate change. About the concern of young generation about climate inaction and climate change and emission reduction, it's crucial to say today we are really concerned about the climate African leaders in action in climate change. How our generation shares a consent and recognize its crucial importance to taking immediate action to mitigate the effect of climate change. African leaders must play the crucial role in this fight. They need to prioritize the development of robust and sustainable environmental policies, as well as the adoption of clean technology. They include invested in renewable energy, protecting a fragile ecosystem, and promoting sustainable lifestyle. And regarding the developing and emerging economy, it is imperative to raise awareness of impact of their emission. This can be achieved through effective communication and awareness campaigns that highlight the devastating consequence of climate change on the most vulnerable people, including those in Africa. International cooperation initiatives are essential to encourage the development economy to take responsibilities and support the effect of developing countries to address climate change. This can involve partnership for the transfer of clean technology, financing adaptation and mitigation project on the establishment of compensation mechanisms for damage caused by past emission. In this fight is really, really important concerning for us to take concrete action with working with developing and emerging economy to raise awareness and encourage them to take responsibility. Sorry.
Thank you so much for that. I'll go back to Dr. Kalibata. Chris have spoken about, the existential threat of climate overshoot for human and for non-human life on Earth. And, based on what we've already spoken about, we've seen many communities are set to migrate and find more hospitable environments due to the current impact of climate change. A lot of public health threats are rising due to pollution, and for us to be able to kind of mitigate transmission of viruses and infectious disease, or that lack of hygiene and sanitation part that we're already battling with on the continent. How do we, in already continent struggling with health systems, how do we kind of find few laws protective of migrants, cope with these consequences, and uphold human dignity in the case of temporary overshoot?
There's going to be a lot, and it's a lot that is already happening in terms of how climate change is impacting human health, in terms of areas now that are have more damage from mosquitoes. Say, for example, insects are becoming more prevalent from that perspective. And I think it was mentioned before, crop damage from insects is also becoming, and spread of these types of damage are becoming much higher. So that's what you're saying is definitely true. So what will we do to stop that or to reduce that? I guess there are a number of things that can be done, but just being able to strengthen public health systems that that can support communities, but also being able to forecast where this damage is likely to happen. And there are very good examples around the continent where people are able to forecast some of this, and based on previous experiences, are able to forecast where some of damage is expected, and people are moved ahead of time to make sure that when this does happen, you've already almost prevented the level of damage it can have to people. But also then just following up with the communities where this has happened and making sure that we strengthen public health systems, that we strengthen emergency support systems so that people are able to deal with this. But I think the most important part is going to be investing in early warning systems so that communities do understand what is coming their way, so that they themselves can be able to avoid some of these challenges. Again, some of the countries have been going through episodes of cholera, like you said earlier. Chris, I think you mentioned that on dysentery, but cholera is also increasingly becoming, we thought that was a problem of the past, but it's becoming an issue now, and again, it's because of the type of floods we are seeing. So just making sure that early warning systems can help people move from areas before damage happens to prevent associated problems, strengthening health systems to ensure that challenges of malaria and others are becoming easy to deal with, but also strengthening community consciousness, because again, sometimes people live in areas where they don't know some of the challenges that are coming their way as a result of climate change. So if you live in an area where malaria is not a problem, and all of a sudden it starts being a problem, being able to inform people ahead of time and being able to invest in diagnosis and being able to help people cope with these problems, because some of these are some of the most dangerous exposures, especially when communities have extremely low ability to cope, even from an immunity perspective. Some of these challenges become extremely high. I guess there's nothing that would beat preparedness, and preparedness would go several ways, even encouraging starting to create, encouraging governments and private sector to start looking at the future, the future of our world. So I work in food and ag, and one of the things we're beginning to look at is the future of food systems, and trying to think about what, to beat Chris at what he's saying, what will food in Africa look like in 20 years? Because what it looks like in 20 years, based on what it is today, is definitely not going to deliver food. So being able to work on that, my institution does think about some of these things, and we start looking at what type of areas and investments do we need to be thinking about, and what type of encouragements and modeling and whatever needs to be done to move countries and the direction of countries of travel when it comes to how we invest in the future, including how we advise private sector. So I mean, I guess every if we had the right level of information, and if we had the right level of prediction of what is coming, you might also say that some of these things present opportunities for how we think about future investments and how we attract private sector in different forms of investments. And again, staying one step ahead, building information systems that allow us to stay one step ahead, building predictive models that allow us to stay one step ahead. I mean, the IPCC is doing a whole lot of work, and Chris, one of the things that I always felt that wasn't being captured enough, but is getting there now, is the predictions on yield loss for Africa. I always felt that that is the levels that people are talking about have nothing to do with what's happening on the continent, because we see total crop failure. And people tell you that, oh, in 2050, we'll lose 20%. I'm like, you really don't live in Africa, you know? Because in many of these countries, you actually see total crop failure. And that's becoming, you might say, yeah, but that was last year. But actually, the problem, which is part of what you said, it's the frequency with which these things happen. And when you add up that frequency and the amount of each, also there's something else that we don't think about. The level of deterioration in existing knowledge systems is also not documented. And for us in Africa, because farming, especially farming and even health systems, and many of the things we do are built on knowledge that is passed on, the level of degradation and deterioration of knowledge in the system as a result of climate change is just immense. And I think, again, there's nothing that will beat in building a strong information system that can help us guide people in real time, but also guide investments in real time. And for health, this is going to be a must, because the alternative is huge loss of life, and we really can't afford it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalibata. I'm going to zoom back to Mr. Sarr, right? The current debate about limiting warming for the end of the century. The current debate about limiting warming for the end of the century, yet data from the WMO and other authoritative voices, report overshot is already happening, just like Dr. Kalibata and Chris have also highlighted. So what needs to be done, immediately and in the medium long term to alleviate the danger on the earth, and to leave our children, to make sure that we leave our children in a livable planet? What do we need to do now and in the medium and long term?
The current debate focus on limiting warming by the end of this century. But many data from the World Meteorological Organization and other authorities south indicate that we are nearing overshoot. This situation demands immediate action as well, and as medium and long-term strategy to alleviate the danger to have and assure a more living planet for our generation. Immediately, for me, there are several crucial steps that must be taken. Firstly, we have to reduce the emission. Rapid and significant reduction of in greenhouse gas emission are paramount. This includes transition or to go to the renewable energy source, improving energy efficiency, and implement sustainable practice across industry. Secondly, for me, we have the second action we can take. We must be taken is to make many adaptation measures. Invest in adaptation measures to mitigate the impact of climate change that are already underway. This includes build resilient infrastructure, protect vulnerable communities, really important, and preserving ecosystem that serve as natural buffer against climate impact. The next one is to work together. I'm talking about on last time is international cooperation. Strengthened international cooperation and commitment to climate action. Meaning that all nations must be work together to set a ambitious target and enforce agreements that prioritize climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. In the medium to longer term, additional action are needed to ensure sustainable future. I can say we can invest in carbon renewable technology is really important. Invested in the research and development of carbon removal technology to actively remove excess carbon dioxide from this for the atmosphere. This include technique and such afforestation, carbon capture and store, and Aaron's retouring. The second one, medium long-term additional action we can take is to practice the sustainable make many sustainable practice, is implement system climate change across all sectors to transition to more sustainable practice. This involvement is to rethink transportation system, agricultural practice, and consumer patterns, and reduce environment impacts. The next one is to invest in the resilience. It's really important to continue to investing in the resilience building measures to adapt to change climate. This includes education and capacity building, many initiatives, as well policies that prioritize equity and social justice in climate adaptation efforts. The last one is to promote education, to promote climate education. It's that in one things I'm working now with many organizations in Senegal. It's really important to prioritize climate education and awareness program to ensure that current and future generation understand the identity to climate action and equip it with the knowledge and skills to contribute in the solution. By taking immediate action and implementing conversion strategy for the medium as to long term, we can also mitigate the worst impact of climate change and leave behind a more living planet for us, firstly, for our children and for future generations.
Thank you so much. I'm coming back to you, Dr. Lennard. Sarr just spoke about carbon capture and other carbon removal technologies. In your opinion, the technological emerging approach for carbon capture, for example, necessary to reduce the risk of climate overshoot, or are they diverting attention from the needed focus on emission reduction? Should African countries join this discussion or oppose it at the multilateral level?
Yeah, thanks, Sarr, for raising that, actually. I think the first thing I need to say about climate overshoot is we will overshoot. There is no risk of not overshooting 1.5 degrees. There's no way we cannot blast through 1.5 degrees by the middle of the 2030s. And we're just going to keep on going. If current policies are implemented, so current NDPs are implemented, NDCs rather, are implemented, we are on trajectory for 2.7 degrees warming by the end of the century. So there's no way we don't overshoot. So you need to put that to bed. The risk of overshoot is almost certain. So what are the consequences then of overshoot? This is what the question needs to be. So what are the impacts of climate overshoot in the African context, and what can we do about it? How do we adapt? How do we mitigate? Those are the questions we actually need to now start thinking about. The technical approaches to reduce CO2 from the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, CDR approaches, they're great, but they're not going to be effective because there is so much CO2 in the atmosphere. You cannot plant enough trees, you cannot build enough machines to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere to actually make a difference. So it's an interesting question to think about, but I don't think it's going to be effective. And again, this is my thought, and there's a fair bit of writing about it. It also in the PCC AR6, I think there's a box on it in one of the places, I can't remember. But yeah, it can't be left to CDR. And since we are talking about technical solutions, I think it's an admission of failure, because we have to speak about these things. It's an admission of failure that we have not adhered to what we said we were going to do to keep things above 1.5 degrees. So even talking about a technical solution is an admission of failure. Having said that, emission reduction is the only way we reduce, I'm going to contradict myself now, but it's the only way we reduce the amount of time we spend above 1.5 degrees. Emissions reduction is critical. But if you speak to me as an African, emission reduction, I'm not the one who's putting the CO2 in the atmosphere. Who is we? Who needs to reduce the emissions? It's not us. It's the Europeans, it's the Chinese, it's the Americans. They're the ones who need to reduce their emissions. And it's, yeah, I really can't stress this enough, that we are receivers of somebody else's emissions in the atmosphere. We are receiving because they are doing. Perhaps in South Africa, we're the only country within Africa who actually features in the top 12 list of emitters of CO2 into the atmosphere, but the rest of Africa doesn't even feature. So this is a problem that we have because of other countries. So what is our responsibility as Africans in terms of emissions? I don't know. Yeah, so who is we? Who needs to? It's not us. And we're not putting CO2 into the atmosphere. However, should we join the discussion was the second part of your question. So the discussion on carbon dioxide removal. There's a question about SRM, solar radiation management in the Q&A. Should we join that discussion? Absolutely. Because we are receivers of climate impacts, we have to be a part of that discussion. We have to know how we will be impacted by global warming as we go on into 2050, 2070. We've got to know, because for climate resilient development, that's the only way we're able to do that. The other question I have there is, who funds this climate resilient development? Because our economies can hardly afford it. We can hardly afford where we are now. In 2050, who's going to fund this? And again, it comes back to who's the source of the problem. It's not us, it's the global north. Are they going to fund our CRD programs? No, they don't. They offer us loans. They don't offer us grants. And we write about this in our Africa chapter also. If the global north was serious about getting Africa to a place where we're carbon neutral, so we don't follow the route that they had to go, they would give us grants. They would give us wind turbines. They would give us solar panels. They would give us batteries. They wouldn't keep their feet on our necks by making us repay loans in 2050. Well, not making us, making our children repay the loans that we have to take out now. So we need to be a part of this discussion. We need to put our African context forward in this discussion. And it's not just Africa, it's also South America, Southeast Asia. We all need to be a part of this global discussion when it comes to technical fixes or technical solutions, in inverted commas, to the climate change problem. And in that, capacity development is crucial. Sarr alluded to this in terms of education. We need to build in the next decade a cohort of researchers, of stakeholders, of policymakers, of thinkers in this context where we think about, so what can we do? What are the options that are open to us? And we need to present the African voice. We don't need to take it from Europe. So again, in the Q&A, there was a question about the UNEA meeting in Nairobi. That wasn't an African voice. That was a European voice telling what Africa to say, or telling Africa what to say. It wasn't an informed voice. It wasn't an African homegrown voice that was there. That was a form of neocolonialism. But anyway, so yeah, we need to absolutely be a part of this conversation. But at the moment, we don't, I think, have a very big community that can be a part of this conversation. So building this community in the next 5 to 10 years is crucial for us to get to. The last thing I'll say about this is often risk. So with technical solutions, at least, often risk is framed as, if we do CDR, it's going to do this, it's going to be a disaster. If we do SRM, it's going to do this, it's going to be a disaster. Without acknowledging that the question has to be framed, if we do CDR, it's going to look like this. If we don't do CDR, so it's just global warming and emissions, it's going to look like this. And then we compare those two features. Same with SRM. If we do SRM, it's going to look bad. If we don't do SRM and just do climate change, it's also going to look bad. Compare those, see what they look like. So we're doing a risk a risk framing. And the UNEP One Atmosphere report that came out last year, I think, spoke about that risk framing. So we will overshoot. We definitely need to be a part of the discussion that thinks about, so we're overshooting, now what can we do? And we need to build capacity within Africa to actually partake authoritatively in these discussions that are going to become more and more over the next decade, particularly as the global north now experiences the impacts of climate change. They've been relatively isolated because they're not as vulnerable as we are, but now they're experiencing climate change. So this is going to become more and more of a thing to talk about. So yeah, we need the African voice to be strong in these discussions of CDR, SRM, and all these other solutions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Chris have already spoken on some of the questions that we have in our Q&A. Now we're going to go to our Q&A. Any of the panelists can jump on the question. There is a question that spoke about how can Africans move beyond the difficult geopolitical tension to respond to the crisis that we're facing on the continent. Anybody can jump on it. In maybe a minute or so, minute and a half. Anyone?
I can come in here, and Chris, I really appreciate the comments you made. I can't tell you how many times I feel like shouting when I'm in a room where people are having these very interesting conversations. To them, and for me, they are not interesting conversations. They are about conversations about people, about missed opportunities, about what I know is possible for this continent and what will never be realized because of what is happening. So yeah, I completely relate. But how can Africa raise above these geopolitical tensions? I think these tensions are always going to be there. And they are going to be there because there's a cost to what is happening. And there's been conversations around how we support Africa to manage some of the challenges and the cost. And there's no agreement on this. All the agreement or conversations are substandard at best in terms of how to help Africa cope with, given the vulnerabilities that we have. So my position is very simple, has always been, if you're in a house and it's on fire, you don't sit and wait for the fire to fall on you. You start running and finding ways to deal with the problem. So there are things that we can do on the African continent. It's a little bit sad, Chris, to hear you say that some of these they're not even quick fixes. They cost money and they are difficult. Planting trees is not going to get us there. I mean, you could say that Africa today does provide, part of the reason we haven't overshoot so far is because Africa has a huge sink for carbon, but we can't plant, even if we planted every inch, we can't plant trees the size of the Congo forests. That would almost be impossible. So whatever sink we would be able to provide, it's going to be just a scratch on the surface of a much bigger problem. The cost to Africa's development is incredible. Africa's oil still sits in the ground because nobody will fund it, especially for sub-Saharan Africa. We have countries that could now be on a development trajectory, that they are not able to do that because they can't. And the unfortunate bit is a number of countries are still digging new wells, and African countries can't touch their own oils to be able to have them contribute to development. So no two wrongs make a right. So Africa will have to do its bit to try to make sure that we stay within what is possible. We are not going to be able to achieve staying below 1.5 by Africa doing the right thing, because Africa is not doing anything wrong. And whatever little that is happening, even if we did it, it would be material. So what we really need to do is to intensify on the fight, on advocating for what is right, and on growing the voice and making sure that it is very clear. And also on saying no to some of the things that are happening. I still don't understand why African countries, yes, I do understand the need But why are we not coming together as a voice around? Why are we getting adaptation financing as loans in an environment that is already completely undermined by COVID-19 and by climate change and by Russia-Ukraine crisis? Why are we accepting this? Why don't we just say no? And I'm 100% sure someone would find sense in why Africa is saying no. But the problem is we have 55 countries that don't have one language. We have 55 countries that are deliberately never going to be able to speak the one language. So it's going to be challenging. But I think for me, recognizing that this problem is bigger than what we can fix within our borders. And we need to come together. And that the biggest strength we have is our voices and our ability to say no to what is wrong is how we stay above this and the fight, and just fight back and find common ways to say no that are going to be audible enough. Because again, like I said, even if South Africa stopped what it's doing, even if Africa planted all sorts of forests, we are not going to get there. We are going to still overshoot, and our people are going to die before everybody else dies. And I mean, it's going to happen. So I think for me, it's that solidarity as a continent around a voice that can get us there is going to be the most important thing. And the sooner our leaders recognize that this is the way we got to go, the sooner we get to have the world listening and the world acting in the right direction. God is helping us in a way. If you believe in God, the fact that this is becoming, I don't wish it for anyone, but this is becoming a global problem rather than only an African problem. It's making people wake up, but we need people to wake up faster than it's happening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalibata. All the questions that we had have been answered. There's a comment that reads, part of the comment reads, untested solutions like SRM have more unknown risk when current solutions on the table reduce emissions have only co-benefit. I'll start with you, Dr. Kalibata, to use 30 seconds to say your last
No, I
word.
leave it to Chris. I leave it to Chris.
Okay, Chris. Chris, you and Yero will close for us our session.
Closing comments. The African voice can be an incredibly effective and loud voice. We have to know how to use our voice that we've got to develop. So the ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol, a lot of that happened because of the Global South voice, and the African voice was loud in that Montreal Protocol to reduce the ozone hole. And that for me is an example of what we can actually do when we coordinate properly. Dr. Kalibata said we're 55 countries, but we speak different languages. When we can work together and we can coordinate and work on a problem, and climate change is the biggest problem that we face. We have political instability, but climate change acts as a stressor on top of all of these other problems. And if we can get our voice together, if we can actually coordinate what we want to say, I think we're incredibly powerful, and we can do that.
Thank you so much, Chris. Mr. Sarr? I think we lost Mr. Sarr. Thank you all for joining us for today's session. This session was recorded. It will be sent in our newsletter, and we hope you will share it, and we hope that you've learned the discussions that are currently happening around Africa in relation to climate overshoot and how we can position ourselves to effectively and adequately respond in a way where Africa will be safe for us to exist in the long run. Thank you for making time to join us today. See you in our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.